Deep in the heart of a dense forest, far away from prying eyes and bustling cities, stood a small but advanced laboratory. This wasn't your typical research facility filled with bubbling beakers or rows of microscopes. Instead, it housed something far more peculiar, a project so daring that even the scientists involved hesitated to speak too loudly about it when others were around. It all began with a simple yet profoundly unsettling question: what happens after death? For centuries, humanity had pondered this mystery. Philosophers debated it, religions offered explanations, and skeptics dismissed it as mere biology shutting down. But no one had ever truly dared to test the boundaries between life and what lies beyond. Until now. The team working on this experiment consisted of 5 brilliant minds, each driven by their own reasons for pursuing answers. Dr. Elena Marks, the leader of the group, was motivated by a deeply personal loss, the sudden passing of her younger brother years ago. She couldn't shake the feeling that there must be more to existence than just nothingness after death. Her colleague, Dr. Richard Hale, approached the subject with cold logic, determined to disprove any supernatural theories once and for all. Then there were 3 others: Sarah, a tech expert specializing in surveillance equipment; Marcus, a forensic scientist familiar with post-mortem processes; and Liam, a physicist intrigued by unexplained phenomena. Their plan was both ingenious and controversial. They decided to place a hidden camera inside a coffin before burying it underground. The idea was straightforward enough: to capture anything unusual that might occur during the burial process or afterward. Was it possible that some form of energy lingered after death? Could there be residual consciousness trapped within the confines of the grave? These questions haunted them as they prepared for the experiment. The subject chosen for this bold endeavor was not human, at least, not entirely human anymore. A terminally ill man named Thomas had volunteered his body for scientific purposes, under extraordinary circumstances. He'd been diagnosed with an aggressive illness that left him bedridden for months, and knowing he wouldn't live much longer, he agreed to participate in the study. His only request was that his family never learn how his remains would be used. For Thomas, it was a chance to leave behind a legacy, albeit a strange one. On the day of the burial, the atmosphere at the lab was tense. Everyone moved with purpose, double-checking every detail to ensure everything went smoothly. The coffin itself was specially designed for the experiment. Made of reinforced wood, it contained a waterproof compartment where the camera was securely fastened. The device was state-of-the-art, capable of recording high-definition video and audio even in complete darkness. It also had a built-in battery that could last up to 72 hours, giving the team ample time to gather data. As the coffin was sealed shut, a somber silence fell over the group. Though none of them voiced it aloud, they couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease. After all, they were about to bury someone, not in the traditional sense, but still, the act carried undeniable weight. Once the preparations were complete, the team transported the coffin to a remote clearing deep within the forest. Here they dug a grave large enough to accommodate it, ensuring the site was isolated enough to avoid attracting attention. When the moment came to lower the coffin into the ground, emotions ran high. Sarah adjusted the final settings on the camera remotely, making sure it was functioning properly. Marcus carefully monitored the soil composition, explaining how different layers of earth might affect readings. Meanwhile, Dr. Marks stood nearby, clutching a clipboard tightly, her knuckles white with anticipation. Even Dr. Hale, who usually maintained a stoic demeanor, seemed unusually quiet. Once the coffin was buried and the dirt patted down, the team gathered around the freshly covered grave. For a few moments, no one spoke. Then, breaking the silence, Liam remarked, "Well, guess we'll find out soon if ghosts are real." His attempt at humor elicited nervous laughter from the group, though the underlying tension remained palpable. Back at the lab, the team huddled around a bank of monitors connected to the hidden camera. The initial footage showed exactly what they expected: pitch-black darkness and absolute silence. At first glance, it appeared as though nothing was happening. Yet, despite the mundane nature of the early results, Excitement buzzed through the room. Every frame represented uncharted territory, a glimpse into the unknown. As the hours ticked by, the scientists took turns analyzing the feed, searching for anything out of the ordinary. But as night fell over the forest, something changed. Subtle shifts in the footage caught their attention. Tiny specks of light flickered intermittently, almost like fireflies trapped inside the coffin. At first, the team assumed it was interference or malfunction, but repeated checks confirmed the camera was functioning perfectly. The lights weren't random either. They seemed to follow a pattern pulsating rhythmically as though alive. Dr. Marks leaned closer to the screen, her brow furrowed in concentration. "This isn't natural," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's deliberate." Her words sent a ripple of unease through the group. None of them had anticipated seeing anything like this so soon. Questions swirled in their minds. Was it some kind of residual energy left behind by Thomas? Or was it something else entirely? Something they hadn't considered? As dawn approached, exhaustion began to set in, but none of them wanted to leave their posts. They knew they were witnessing something extraordinary, something that could redefine humanity's understanding of death itself. Little did they realize, however, that this was only the beginning. What awaited them in the coming days would challenge not only their intellect but also their courage, and perhaps their sanity. The second day of the experiment began with a mixture of anticipation and unease. The scientists had spent the previous night poring over the initial footage, their minds racing with theories about the flickering lights they'd observed. Though none of them could explain it definitively, the phenomenon was enough to keep them glued to their monitors, waiting for more clues. The lab buzzed with quiet conversations as they speculated about what might happen next. Some suggested the lights were simply a trick of the camera's sensors or reflections caused by moisture in the soil. Others whispered about the possibility of something far less rational, something that couldn't be easily dismissed. By mid-morning, the team decided to take shifts monitoring the feed. Dr. Elena Marks insisted on staying up most of the time, her determination fueled by both scientific curiosity and a deeply personal need for answers. She couldn't shake the image of her late brother from her mind. Every time she looked at the screen, she wondered if this experiment might finally give her closure, or perhaps open doors she wasn't ready to walk through. As the hours dragged on, the footage remained largely unchanged. The coffin was still, shrouded in darkness, and aside from the occasional flicker of light, nothing seemed out of place. But just as fatigue started to creep in, something new appeared on the screen. A faint sound. At first, it was so soft that Sarah, who was manning the audio equipment, thought it might be static or interference. She adjusted the settings, trying to filter out any background noise, but the sound persisted. It was muffled, almost like whispers carried on the wind, yet there was no breeze in the sealed coffin. "Do you hear that?" Sarah asked, turning to the others. Her voice was hesitant, tinged with uncertainty. Dr. Richard Hale leaned forward, his skeptical demeanor giving way to cautious interest. "It's probably just the soil shifting," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. He glanced at Marcus, hoping for some logical explanation, but the forensic scientist merely shrugged. None of them had anticipated hearing anything so soon, or at all. Over the next few hours, the sounds grew clearer. What had started as indistinct murmurs evolved into fragments of words. The team huddled around the monitor, straining to make sense of what they were hearing. One word stood out. "Help." It was barely audible, spoken in a voice that sounded distant and strained, as though emanating from another world. Then came other phrases: "Not ready," "Let me go," and even names, some of which matched those of Thomas's family members. The room fell silent as the weight of these discoveries sank in. "This can't be real," Dr. Hale muttered, rubbing his temples. "There has to be a rational explanation." But rational explanations seemed harder to come by with each passing moment. The voices didn't align with any known recordings or environmental factors. They weren't echoes of living people nearby either. The burial site was isolated, miles away from civilization. As much as Dr. Hale wanted to dismiss the findings. He couldn't ignore the chill running down his spine. Dr. Marks, on the other hand, felt a mix of awe and dread. For years, she'd wondered if consciousness could linger after death. Now, faced with evidence that suggested it might, she wasn't sure how to feel. Was this proof of an afterlife? Or was it something darker, something they couldn't fully comprehend? She scribbled notes furiously, documenting every detail while Liam ran tests on the audio equipment to rule out malfunctions. As evening approached, tensions within the group began to rise. The initial excitement of discovery gave way to unease. Sarah, usually calm and collected, found herself glancing nervously at the door, as if expecting someone, or something, to burst in uninvited. Marcus paced back and forth, muttering under his breath about variables they might have missed. Even Liam, whose fascination with the unknown had initially driven him to join the project, seemed shaken. "We should stop," Dr. Hale declared suddenly, breaking the tense silence. His voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. "This isn't science anymore. We're playing with forces we don't understand." Dr. Marks shot him a sharp look. "And what do you suggest we do instead? Pretend we didn't see this? Walk away from the biggest discovery in human history?" "It's not a discovery," Dr. Hale snapped. "It's a mistake, a fluke. Whatever's happening here isn't natural, and continuing this experiment is reckless." The argument escalated quickly, with both sides presenting impassioned arguments. Dr. Marks believed they owed it to humanity, and to Thomas, to see the experiment through. Dr. Hale countered that they were tampering with things beyond their control, risking consequences they couldn't predict. The debate grew heated, voices rising until Sarah intervened. "Enough," she shouted, surprising everyone. Normally soft-spoken, her outburst silenced the room. "We're not going to solve anything by fighting. Let's focus on the facts. If we want to understand what's happening, we need to stay objective. That means no assumptions, no jumping to conclusions, just data." Her words brought a temporary truce, but the underlying tension remained. The team agreed to continue monitoring the footage overnight, taking turns to ensure constant vigilance. Despite their resolve, sleep eluded them. Every creak of the lab's old floorboards, every shadow cast by the dim overhead lights, sent jolts of paranoia through their exhausted minds. Around midnight, the atmosphere shifted again. The voices on the feed became louder, overlapping in a chaotic symphony of whispers. Some sounded pleading, others angry, and a few eerily calm. The team exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to attribute the escalation to technical issues or something more sinister. Then, without warning, the camera captured something that froze them in their tracks. A faint glow emerged inside the coffin, illuminating the interior ever so slightly. It wasn't the same flickering light they'd seen before. This glow was steady, almost ethereal. Shadows danced across the walls of the confined space, moving in patterns that defied logic. The team watched in stunned silence as the shapes twisted and contorted, forming outlines that resembled human figures, but distorted, as if viewed through rippling water. "What is that?" Marcus whispered, his voice trembling. No one answered. They were too transfixed by the unfolding scene to speak. The shadows seemed alive, pulsating with an energy that made the hair on their necks stand on end. For a brief moment, one of the figures paused, its silhouette facing directly toward the camera. It was impossible to discern any features, yet the posture conveyed intent, as though it knew it was being watched. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the glow faded, plunging the coffin back into darkness. The whispers ceased, leaving behind an oppressive silence that weighed heavily on the room. The team sat motionless, their hearts pounding in unison. No one dared to break the spell. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Dr. Marks exhaled sharply. "Did anyone else see that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. They nodded, too shaken to respond verbally. Whatever they had witnessed transcended the boundaries of science and reason. It was no longer just an experiment. It was a confrontation with the unknown. And as the hours ticked by, one thing became painfully clear. They were in over their heads. Despite the fear gnawing at them, the scientists couldn't bring themselves to turn off the monitors. Each frame of footage held the promise, or the threat, of further revelations. They knew they were venturing into uncharted territory, but the allure of uncovering the truth kept them tethered to their posts. Little did they realize, however, that the worst was yet to come. By the third day of the experiment, the atmosphere in the lab had shifted dramatically. What had started as a bold scientific endeavor now felt like a descent into uncharted and increasingly unsettling territory. The team was no longer united by curiosity. Instead, they were divided by fear, skepticism, and an unspoken dread that lingered in the air like a storm cloud waiting to burst. The footage from the hidden camera continued to defy explanation, and the strange phenomena showed no signs of stopping. If anything, they were escalating. The previous night's events, the glowing light, the shadowy figures, and the eerie whispers had left everyone shaken. Dr. Elena Marks tried to maintain her composure, but even she couldn't hide the dark circles under her eyes or the way her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the monitor settings. She replayed the footage repeatedly, searching for patterns or clues that might explain what they were witnessing. Every time she watched it, though, the same question swirled in her mind. Were these shadows remnants of Thomas's consciousness? Or was something else, something far older and more powerful, reaching out from beyond? Dr. Richard Hale, on the other hand, had grown increasingly agitated. He paced the length of the lab, muttering to himself about irresponsible science and reckless speculation. His skepticism had hardened into outright resistance, and he made no secret of his desire to shut down the experiment. "This isn't research anymore," he snapped during one particularly heated exchange. "It's madness. We're dealing with forces we can't control, and we have no idea what kind of consequences this could unleash." Sarah, who had always been the calm and methodical member of the team, found herself caught between the two extremes. Part of her agreed with Dr. Hale. They were treading dangerous ground, but another part of her couldn't deny the thrill of discovery. There was something undeniably fascinating about the footage, something that hinted at truths far greater than anything they'd imagined. Still, the unease gnawing at her stomach grew stronger with each passing hour. She began noticing things, outside the lab too. Faint noises in the hallway late at night, shadows moving just out of sight when she glanced over her shoulder. Rational explanations eluded her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, not just by whatever was in the coffin, but by something closer. Liam, the physicist, spent most of his time analyzing the audio recordings, hoping to find some logical explanation for the voices. He ran complex algorithms to filter out background noise, cross-referenced frequencies, and even consulted obscure texts on acoustics and sound waves. But no matter how hard he tried, the voices remained inexplicable. They didn't match any known language or dialect, and their tone carried an otherworldly quality that sent chills down his spine. One phrase, repeated several times throughout the recordings, haunted him more than the others. "You shouldn't have opened it." "What does that mean?" Marcus asked one evening, breaking the silence as they huddled around the monitors. His voice was low, almost reverent, as if speaking too loudly might summon whatever was behind the message. "I don't know," Liam admitted, rubbing his temples. "But it doesn't sound like something we want to ignore." As the hours dragged on, the tension in the room became palpable. Conversations dwindled to terse exchanges, and the usual camaraderie that had once defined the team was replaced by wary glances and guarded words. Even simple tasks, like refilling coffee cups or adjusting equipment, felt fraught with significance. Everyone was hyper-aware of their surroundings, jumping at every creak of the building's old wooden floors or rustle of leaves outside the window. Then, just after midnight, the footage revealed something that shattered whatever fragile sense of normalcy remained. The camera captured movement, not outside the coffin, but inside. Shadows shifted again, more pronounced this time, forming distinct shapes that seemed to interact with one another. One figure appeared to stretch out a hand, its silhouette reaching toward the lens as if trying to touch it. The gesture was deliberate, almost accusatory, and it sent a collective shiver through the team. Is that possible?" Sarah stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I mean, the coffin is sealed. There's no way anything could get in or move like that." "It's not possible," Dr. Hale said firmly, though his face betrayed his doubt. "We're seeing things that aren't there. This has to be some kind of malfunction." But deep down, even he wasn't convinced. The clarity of the images ruled out technical errors, and the consistency of the phenomena suggested something far more deliberate. Whatever was happening inside that coffin, it wasn't random or accidental. As dawn approached, the team reached a breaking point. Dr. Marks insisted they needed to continue monitoring the footage, arguing that abandoning the experiment now would mean turning their backs on potentially groundbreaking discoveries. Dr. Hale countered that they were risking their safety, and perhaps their sanity, by pursuing this further. Their arguments grew louder, echoing off the lab walls until Sarah intervened once again. "Enough," she shouted, slamming her palms on the table. Her outburst silenced the room, leaving only the soft hum of the monitors in the background. "We're not going to solve anything by fighting. Let's focus on what we can do next. If we're scared, fine. If we're skeptical, fine. But we owe it to ourselves, and to Thomas, to figure out what's really going on." Her words struck a chord, and for a moment the tension eased. They decided to take a short break, agreeing to reconvene in an hour to discuss their options. As they dispersed, however, none of them could shake the feeling that they were running out of time. Something about the footage felt urgent, as if whatever was inside the coffin was growing impatient. When they returned, the mood had shifted again. This time it was Marcus who spoke up, his voice trembling with a mix of excitement and fear. "What if it's not just Thomas?" he asked, his eyes darting between his colleagues. What if we've disturbed something else? Something that was buried long before we got here?" The suggestion hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. No one wanted to entertain the idea, but none of them could dismiss it either. The forest where they'd buried the coffin was ancient, its history steeped in local legends of spirits and curses. Could they have unwittingly tapped into something older and darker than they'd anticipated? Before anyone could respond, the monitors flickered briefly, drawing their attention back to the footage. The camera feed showed the interior of the coffin bathed in a pale, pulsating light. The shadows moved faster now, swirling chaotically as if caught in a storm. And then, for the first time, the camera captured something unmistakable. A face. It was distorted, almost liquid-like but undeniably humanoid. Its mouth opened wide, emitting a sound so piercing that it caused feedback in the speakers, forcing the team to cover their ears. When the noise subsided, the screen went black. For a moment the lab was eerily silent. Then one by one the lights overhead began to dim, plunging the room into darkness. Panic set in as the scientists scrambled to restore power, but nothing worked. The monitors remained dead, offering no glimpse of what might be happening underground. In the chaos that followed, Dr. Marks made a decision that would change everything. Against protocol, and against the protests of her colleagues, she announced that they needed to dig up the coffin immediately. "We can't wait any longer," she said, her voice resolute despite the fear in her eyes. "If we're dealing with something beyond our understanding, we need to confront it head-on. We owe it to ourselves to see this through." Dr. Hale vehemently opposed the idea, warning that exhuming the coffin could make matters worse. But his objections fell on deaf ears. By the time the sun rose over the horizon, the team had packed their equipment and prepared to return to the burial site. None of them knew what awaited them beneath the soil, or whether they would come back unchanged. One thing was certain: they were about to step into the unknown, and there was no turning back. The journey back to the burial site was fraught with tension. The team loaded their equipment into a van, each member lost in their own thoughts as they drove through the dense forest. The morning sun filtered weakly through the canopy of trees, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the road. No one spoke much during the ride. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. Despite the daylight, an unsettling gloom hung over them, as if the very air around them had grown heavier since the events of the previous night. When they arrived at the clearing, the sight of the freshly covered grave sent a shiver down everyone's spine. The mound of earth looked innocuous enough, just dirt and grass, but it felt alive somehow, as though it pulsed with energy beneath the surface. Dr. Elena Marks wasted no time, directing the others to begin digging. Her determination bordered on obsession now, her earlier scientific curiosity giving way to something more primal. She needed answers, not just for the sake of science, but because she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever lay beneath the soil was calling to her. Dr. Richard Hale reluctantly joined in, his skepticism warring with a growing sense of unease. He didn't believe in ghosts or supernatural forces, but he couldn't deny the strange phenomena they'd witnessed either. Each shovel of dirt he moved felt like lifting a veil between worlds, exposing something ancient and unknowable. Marcus worked methodically, his hands steady despite the tremor of fear running through him. Liam and Sarah exchanged nervous glances as they cleared away the topsoil, both silently wondering what horrors might await them once the coffin was unearthed. As the digging progressed, the atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive. The temperature dropped noticeably, even though it was mid-morning and a faint mist began to rise from the ground. It swirled lazily at first, but soon thickened, obscuring their vision and making the air taste metallic. The team paused briefly, exchanging uneasy looks. None of them could explain the sudden change in weather. It wasn't listed in any forecasts, nor did it match the conditions elsewhere in the area. It was localized, confined to this patch of earth, as if nature itself recoiled from what lay buried below. Finally, after what felt like hours, the tip of the coffin emerged from the soil. The wood was damp and stained, its once smooth surface marred by streaks of mud and moss. Dr. Mark signaled for them to stop, her breath quickening as she knelt beside the exposed edge. "Careful," she murmured, more to herself than to the others. "We don't know what we're dealing with." Using crowbars, they pried open the lid, bracing themselves for what might be inside. What they found defied all logic and chilled them to their core. The body of Thomas remained intact, untouched by decay despite being buried for days. But it was not the corpse itself that drew their attention. Surrounding it were symbols etched deeply into the inner walls of the coffin, symbols none of them recognized. They glowed faintly, pulsating with a soft, otherworldly light that cast eerie shadows across the confined space. The patterns were intricate, almost hypnotic, swirling, together in ways that suggested movement even when still. "What are those?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. She reached out instinctively toward the markings only to recoil as if burned. The air around the symbols crackled with energy, sending a sharp tingle up her arm. "They're warm." "Doctor," Hale stepped forward, his face pale but resolute. "This is impossible," he muttered, shaking his head. "Wood doesn't retain heat like this. And where did these symbols come from? We checked the coffin before burying it. They weren't there." No one had an answer. The symbols seemed to hum with a life of their own, vibrating faintly under the scientists' scrutiny. As they leaned closer to examine them, the camera, the same device they'd placed inside the coffin, was nowhere to be found. In its place sat an object that made their blood run cold, an ancient-looking artifact resembling a key. It was small, no larger than a human hand, forged from a material none of them could identify. Its surface was smooth yet textured, engraved, with similar symbols to those lining the coffin walls. Dr. Marks picked it up cautiously, her fingers brushing against the cool metal. Instantly, the ground beneath them quaked violently, throwing them off balance. A deafening roar echoed through the clearing, reverberating deep within their chests. Trees swayed precariously, their branches snapping under the force of the tremor, while the mist thickened until visibility was reduced to mere inches. Panic erupted among the team as they scrambled to their feet, unsure whether to flee or stay. "Put it back," Dr. Hale shouted, pointing frantically at the artifact in Dr. Marks's hand. "Whatever you've done, undo it." But it was too late. The artifact emitted a blinding flash of light, forcing them to shield their eyes. When the brightness faded, the coffin and the body inside were gone. In their place stood a figure, humanoid yet grotesquely distorted, its form flickering, like static on a television screen. Its features were indistinct, constantly shifting between shapes and textures as if unable to settle on a single identity. Yet its presence was undeniable, radiating an aura of malevolence so potent it made it hard to breathe. The entity raised a claw-like appendage, gesturing toward the team. Though it made no sound, its intent was clear. It wanted the artifact. Dr. Marks tightened her grip on the key, her instincts screaming at her to hold on to it. She didn't understand why, but she knew instinctively that letting go would unleash something far worse than anything they'd encountered so far. "We need to leave. Now," Liam yelled, grabbing Sarah's arm and pulling her toward the van. Marcus followed suit, his face ashen with terror. Dr. Hale hesitated, torn between fleeing and confronting the entity. For a moment, he locked eyes with Dr. Marks, who stood frozen in place, clutching the artifact tightly. "Elena, don't do this," Dr. Hale pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. "You don't know what you're messing with." "I can't let it have this," she replied, her tone firm despite the fear in her eyes. "Not yet." With a final glance at the entity, Dr. Hale turned and sprinted toward the van, leaving Dr. Marks alone in the clearing. The roar intensified, shaking the earth violently as the figure advanced toward her. Summoning every ounce of courage, she backed away slowly, keeping the artifact clutched to her chest. When she reached the van, she climbed in without looking back, slamming the door shut behind her. The engine roared to life as Liam sped away, tires skidding on the uneven path. Behind them, the clearing faded into the distance, swallowed by the encroaching mist. No one spoke as they drove, adrenaline coursing through their veins. The artifact sat ominously in Dr. Marks's lap, its glow dimmed but still visible. Whatever they had awakened or disturbed wasn't finished with them yet. Back at the lab, the team barricaded themselves inside, unsure of what to do next. The artifact remained at the center of the table, its presence dominating the room. Every few minutes the lights would flicker, and the monitors displayed static-filled images of shadowy figures moving just beyond the edges of perception. The whispers returned too, louder this time, overlapping in a cacophony of voices that seemed to echo directly in their minds. "We need to destroy it," Dr. Hale said finally, breaking the tense silence. "Whatever it is, it's dangerous. We shouldn't have brought it here." "And risk releasing whatever's bound to it?" Dr. Marks countered, her voice steady despite the exhaustion etched on her face. "If we destroy it, we might make things worse. We need to understand it first." "Understand it?" Dr. Hale snapped, his patience wearing thin. "How do you propose we do that? Study it like some kind of science project? This isn't science anymore, it's survival." The argument escalated quickly, but before it could spiral further, Sarah interrupted. "Look," she said, pointing at the monitors. On the screens, new footage had appeared, grainy, distorted images of the clearing they'd fled. The entity was still there, standing motionless amidst the wreckage they'd left behind. But now, it was accompanied by others, their forms equally unstable and menacing. "They're coming," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. The realization hit them all at once. They weren't safe. Whatever they had unleashed wasn't confined to the forest, it was spreading, and they had no idea how to stop it. In the days that followed, reports began surfacing of bizarre occurrences in the surrounding area. People claimed to see shadowy figures lurking in the woods, electronic devices malfunctioned inexplicably, and locals spoke of hearing disembodied whispers in the dead of night. The team knew they were responsible, but guilt offered little comfort. They had opened a door they couldn't close, and now they were paying the price. For Dr. Marks, the artifact became both a burden and an obsession. She studied it relentlessly, searching for clues about its origin and purpose. Yet the deeper she delved, the more questions arose. One thing became painfully clear. They weren't dealing with something human, or even earthly. Whatever the artifact represented, it was tied to forces far older and more powerful than humanity. And it wasn't done with them yet. The days that followed the exhumation of the coffin were a blur of paranoia, sleepless nights, and mounting dread. The artifact, the mysterious key-like object, remained at the center of everything, its presence casting a long shadow over the team. Dr. Elena Marks refused to let it out of her sight, convinced that destroying it or abandoning it would only invite disaster. Yet, the longer it stayed in their possession, the more unstable their environment became. The lab, once a sanctuary of reason and discovery, now felt like a prison haunted by unseen forces. Every corner of the facility seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. Lights flickered incessantly, no matter how many times they replaced the bulbs. Monitors displayed static-filled images of shadowy figures moving just beyond the edges of perception, their forms indistinct but menacing. The whispers returned too, louder and more insistent this time, echoing through the speakers connected to the audio equipment. They weren't confined to the recordings from the burial site anymore. They permeated every room, seeping into the scientists' minds even when the devices were turned off. It was as if the voices had taken on a life of their own, speaking directly to them in fragmented sentences that made little sense but carried unmistakable urgency. Dr. Richard Hale grew, increasingly desperate. He spent hours poring over ancient texts and obscure scientific journals, searching for anything remotely resembling the artifact or the symbols etched into the coffin. His skepticism had crumbled under the weight of what they'd witnessed, replaced by a grim determination to find answers, any answers, that might explain what they were dealing with. "This isn't random," he muttered one evening, flipping through a dusty book on occult practices. "These symbols, they're not just decorative. They mean something. Someone, or something, put them there for a reason." Sarah, who had always prided herself on her calm demeanor, found herself unraveling. She jumped at every sound, convinced she could hear footsteps behind her even when no one else was in the room. Shadows seemed to move across the walls when she wasn't looking, and she swore she caught glimpses of figures darting just outside her line of vision. Her hands trembled as she worked, making simple tasks feel Herculean. One night, while adjusting the camera feeds, she froze. On one of the monitors, a figure stood perfectly still in the corner of the lab, a humanoid silhouette with glowing eyes that stared directly at the lens. She screamed, startling the others. But when they rushed to check, the screen showed nothing but empty space. Liam, ever the analytical thinker, tried to approach the situation logically. He ran tests on the artifact, subjecting it to electromagnetic scans, thermal imaging, and spectral analysis. But the results defied explanation. The material didn't match any known element, and its properties fluctuated unpredictably. At times, it emitted waves of energy strong enough to disrupt nearby electronics. Other times, it seemed inert, almost mocking their efforts to understand it. Despite his best attempts to remain objective, Liam couldn't shake the feeling that the artifact was alive, not in the biological sense, but in a way that transcended human comprehension. It wasn't just an object, it was aware. Marcus, the forensic scientist, became withdrawn, retreating into himself as the days wore on. He rarely spoke, spending most of his time staring blankly at the wall or scribbling notes in a journal he kept close to his chest. When pressed about what he was writing, he simply shook his head and mumbled something about patterns and connections. His behavior unnerved the others, especially when they noticed him muttering phrases under his breath, phrases that sounded eerily similar to the whispers coming from the monitors. As tensions mounted, so did the strange occurrences. Equipment malfunctioned without warning, forcing them to rely on manual tools and outdated methods. Supplies went missing, only to reappear in bizarre places. Tools found stacked neatly on shelves where they hadn't been before, or personal belongings scattered across the floor as if someone had rifled through them. Doors locked themselves and windows rattled violently despite there being no wind. The air grew colder, even though the heating system was functioning properly, and an oppressive silence settled over the lab whenever the power failed, leaving them stranded in darkness. One particularly harrowing night, the team gathered around. the table where the artifact rested, each member clutching cups of coffee that had long gone cold. Exhaustion hung heavy on their faces, but none of them dared to sleep. Every time they closed their eyes, nightmares plagued them, vivid dreams filled with shadowy landscapes, haunting whispers, and the ever-present glow of the artifact. Dr. Marks finally broke the silence, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and resolve. "We can't keep going like this," she said. "Whatever this thing is, it's feeding off us. We're giving it exactly what it wants, our fear, our confusion, our despair. What do you suggest we do?" Dr. Hale asked bitterly. "Destroy it? Throw it back into the ground? We don't even know what it is." "Maybe we don't need to destroy it," Sarah interjected softly. All eyes turned to her, surprised by her sudden contribution. She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "What if we try to communicate with it? If these symbols and the whispers are some kind of language, maybe we can figure out what it wants. Maybe it's trying to tell us something." The suggestion hung in the air, met with skeptical stares and uneasy murmurs. Communicating with an unknown entity felt reckless, bordering on suicidal. But as the discussion unfolded, they realized they had few options left. Running away wouldn't solve anything. The phenomena followed them wherever they went. Destroying the artifact risked unleashing whatever force it contained, and ignoring it had already proven futile. Reluctantly, they agreed to attempt communication, though none of them felt confident about the outcome. Using the data collected from the artifact and the symbols, Liam and Dr. Hale worked tirelessly to decode potential patterns. They cross-referenced ancient languages, cryptographic techniques, and even musical frequencies, hoping to unlock some hidden meaning. Meanwhile, Dr. Marks and Sarah focused on replicating the conditions of the burial site, believing that recreating the environment might help establish a connection. Marcus, however, remained aloof, offering little input beyond cryptic comments about cycles and loops. After 2 exhausting days, they thought they had made progress. The symbols appeared to form a sequence, repeating in a specific order that suggested rhythm or cadence. Using a combination of tones generated by specialized software, they attempted to mimic the pattern, playing it aloud in the lab. At first, nothing happened. The artifact remained dormant, its surface cool and unresponsive. Just as they began to lose hope, a low hum filled the room, resonating deep within their chests. The lights dimmed, and the monitors flickered wildly, displaying chaotic streams of images that shifted too quickly to comprehend. Then suddenly the artifact flared to life. A blinding light erupted from its core, engulfing the entire lab. The team shielded their eyes, bracing themselves for whatever might come next. When the brightness subsided, they found themselves standing in a place unlike anything they'd ever seen. The walls of the lab were gone, replaced by an endless expanse of shifting shadows and pulsating light. Figures moved in the distance, their forms fluid and indistinct, yet undeniably watching them. The air vibrated with a deafening roar, mingled with the familiar whispers that now sounded clearer than ever. "You shouldn't have opened it," a voice boomed, reverberating through the void. It wasn't coming from any single direction. It surrounded them, filling the space with an overwhelming presence. The words sent chills down their spines, confirming their worst fears. They had disturbed something far greater than themselves. Before they could react, the scene shifted again. Images flashed before their eyes, scenes of destruction, chaos, and unimaginable suffering. Entire cities crumbling into dust, skies darkened by swirling storms, and countless souls trapped in eternal torment. Each vision lasted only seconds, but the impact lingered, etching itself into their memories with horrifying clarity. And then, as abruptly as it began, the vision ended. They were back in the lab, gasping for air, their bodies trembling with adrenaline. The artifact sat quietly on the table, its glow dimmed once more. None of them spoke, too shaken to articulate what they had just experienced. Whatever they had communicated with, it hadn't offered answers. It had issued a warning. Dr. Marks was the first to break the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "We've crossed a line," she said, tears streaming down her face. And I don't think we can go back. The others nodded, their expressions grim. They knew they were out of their depth, grappling with forces they couldn't begin to understand. Yet even as fear gripped their hearts, a question lingered in the air. What had they truly unleashed? And how much worse would things get before it was over? For now, the artifact remained with them, its secret still locked away. But the whispers continued, growing louder with each passing day. Whatever waited on the other side of the veil, it wasn't done with them yet. The final days of the experiment were a descent into chaos, both inside and outside the lab. The artifact, the key-like object that had become the epicenter of their nightmare, continued to exert its influence, twisting reality in ways none of them could have imagined. Each morning brought new horrors, each night deeper despair. The team was no longer functioning as a cohesive unit. They were fractured, haunted individuals struggling to hold on to whatever scraps of sanity remained. Dr. Elena Marks bore the brunt of the burden. She carried the artifact everywhere she went, convinced that abandoning it would only worsen the situation. Yet her fixation came at a cost. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her hands trembled constantly, whether from exhaustion or fear, she couldn't tell. Her dreams, if they could even be called that, were plagued by visions of the void they had glimpsed during their attempt at communication. The endless expanse of shifting shadows, the deafening roar, and the soul-crushing images of destruction replayed in her mind like a broken record. She woke up screaming more often than not, drenched in sweat and clutching the artifact as if it were a lifeline. Dr. Richard Hale had retreated into himself, his skepticism replaced by a grim resignation. He spent hours scribbling notes in a journal, documenting every occurrence, no matter how small. His handwriting became increasingly erratic, filled with crossed-out words and frantic underlines. At times he muttered to himself, debating aloud about whether they should destroy the artifact or return it to the ground where they had found it. But deep down, he knew neither option offered salvation. Whatever force they had awakened was already loose, spreading its tendrils far beyond the confines of the lab. Sarah, once the calmest member of the team, was now a shell of her former self. Her sharp focus and methodical nature had given way to paranoia and panic. She avoided looking directly at the artifact, convinced it was watching her. Shadows seemed to follow her wherever she went, and the whispers grew louder in her ears, sometimes so intense that she pressed her hands against her temples to block them out. One evening, while reviewing footage from the cameras, she froze. On one of the monitors, her reflection stared back at her. But something was wrong. Instead of her own eyes, two glowing orbs gleamed in their place, pulsating with an unnatural light. She screamed, dropping the laptop. But when the others rushed to check, the screen showed nothing unusual. Liam, who had always approached problems with logic and reason, found himself questioning everything he thought he knew. The tests he ran on the artifact yielded inconsistent results, as if it were mocking their efforts to understand it. Its energy readings fluctuated wildly, sometimes spiking to dangerous levels, other times fading completely. He began to suspect that the artifact wasn't merely an object, it was sentient, feeding off their fear and confusion. During one particularly harrowing session, he swore he saw it shift slightly on the table as though it were alive. When he mentioned this to the others, they dismissed it as stress-induced hallucination, but the doubt lingered in his mind. Marcus, meanwhile, had withdrawn almost entirely. He rarely left his corner of the lab, hunched over his journal, muttering phrases that made little sense to anyone else. "It's a cycle," he whispered one day, his voice barely audible. "We're part of it, always have been." When Dr. Marks asked him what he meant, he simply shook his head and refused to elaborate. His behavior grew increasingly erratic, culminating in a terrifying incident late one night. While everyone else slept, or tried to, he stood over the artifact, holding a hammer above it. Before anyone could intervene, he brought the tool down with all his strength, intending to smash it. But instead of shattering, the artifact emitted a blinding flash of light, knocking him backward. When he regained consciousness, he claimed to remember nothing, yet his journal contained pages upon pages of frantic scrawls, detailing events none of them had witnessed. As the days turned into weeks, the phenomena spilled out of the lab and into the surrounding area. Reports poured in from nearby towns of bizarre occurrences, unexplained power outages, animals behaving erratically, and sightings of shadowy figures lurking in the woods. People spoke of hearing disembodied whispers, identical to those tormenting the scientists, echoing through empty streets and abandoned buildings. Some claimed to see flickering lights in the forest at night, moving in patterns that defied natural explanation. The local authorities dismissed these accounts as mass hysteria, but the team knew better. They had unleashed something, and it was spreading. One fateful night, the team decided to make one last desperate attempt to contain the situation. Gathering around the artifact, they devised a plan to bury it again, hoping that returning it to the earth might seal whatever door they had opened. Dr. Marks reluctantly agreed, though her instincts screamed at her not to let go of the object. As they prepared to transport it back to the burial site, the lab was plunged into darkness. The power failed, plunging them into an oppressive silence broken only by the sound of their ragged breathing. When the emergency lights flickered on, moments later the artifact was gone. Panic erupted as they searched frantically for it, overturning furniture and scanning every inch of the room. It wasn't until Sarah spotted movement on one of the monitors that they realized the truth. The artifact hadn't disappeared. It had moved. On the screen, it hovered inches above the floor, suspended by an unseen force. The symbols etched into its surface glowed brighter than ever, casting eerie shadows across the walls. Then, without warning, it shot toward the ceiling, phasing through solid material as if it didn't exist and vanished into thin air. Before they could process what had happened, the ground beneath them began to quake violently. The walls cracked, and dust rained down from the ceiling as the entire structure groaned under the strain. Outside, the forest seemed alive with movement, trees swaying unnaturally despite the absence of wind. A deafening roar echoed through the air, shaking the very foundation of the building. The team stumbled toward the exit, their hearts pounding. With terror, they emerged into a scene straight out of a nightmare. The clearing where they had buried the coffin was ablaze with unearthly light. The ground split open to reveal a chasm of swirling shadows. Figures emerged from the abyss, humanoid yet grotesquely distorted, their forms flickering like static. Their glowing eyes locked onto the team, and they advanced slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the moment. "We shouldn't have opened it," one of the figures rasped, its voice overlapping with countless others. The phrase reverberated in their minds, louder and more insistent than ever before. It wasn't just a warning, it was an accusation. Dr. Marks stepped forward, her body trembling but her resolve unshaken. Clutching the journal Marcus had kept, which inexplicably reappeared in her hands, she shouted, "What do you want from us?" For a moment, the figures paused. Then, in unison, they raised claw-like appendages, pointing not at the team, but at the horizon. Beyond the forest, the sky churned with dark clouds, lightning flashing in jagged bursts. Cities crumbled in the distance, consumed by fire and ash. The vision lasted only seconds, but its message was clear. The end was coming, and humanity was powerless to stop it. Without another word, the figures retreated into the chasm, which sealed itself with a deafening boom. The ground stabilized and the unnatural glow faded, leaving behind an eerie silence. The team stood frozen, unable to comprehend what they had just witnessed. In the days that followed, life returned to some semblance of normalcy, or at least as close to normal as they could manage. The phenomena ceased, the whispers stopped, and the lab fell quiet. Yet none of them could shake the feeling that they had merely delayed the inevitable. The artifact was gone, but its influence lingered, embedded in their memories and nightmares. Dr. Marks eventually published a paper detailing their findings, though she omitted the most disturbing aspects of the experiment. Critics dismissed her work as pseudoscience, but she didn't care. Her goal wasn't validation, it was a warning. Buried within the pages of her report was a single line, written in bold letters: "Some doors should never be opened." Years later, reports of strange occurrences continued to surface in the area. Locals spoke of shadowy figures appearing in photographs, electronic devices malfunctioning without explanation, and an overwhelming sense of dread that permeated the forest. The burial site remained undisturbed, marked only by a weathered wooden cross erected by superstitious townsfolk. As for the team, their lives were forever changed. Dr. Marks dedicated herself to studying the unknown, driven by guilt and a need for redemption. Dr. Hale retreated from academia altogether, living in seclusion and refusing to speak of the experiment. Sarah sought therapy to cope with the trauma, though the whispers still haunted her dreams. Liam disappeared one day, leaving behind only his notes and theories about interdimensional entities. And Marcus? Well, no one knew what became of him. After that night in the lab, what lay beneath the soil and beyond the veil of death remained a mystery. But one thing was certain: humanity had caught a glimpse of eternity, and it was not ready for what it saw.